Repeat of a statement made in the House of Commons today, approval of funds for full and final settlement for postmasters with overturned criminal convictions. Lord Callanan.
My Lords, with the leave of the House, I shall now repeat a statement made in another place by my honourable friend, the Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for Small Business, Consumer and Labour Markets. The statement is as follows. Mr. Speaker, with permission, I will make a statement on the latest steps that the Government is taking to ensure that swift and fair compensation is made available to postmasters whose Horizon-related convictions are quashed. The House is very well aware of the terrible impact felt by the many postmasters affected by issues with the Post Office's Horizon IT system. These distressing consequences have been widely documented both in the courts, in the 2019 GLO judgments, and in the more recent Court of Appeal judgments, as well as in the media. I have met with postmasters personally to hear how their lives and the lives of their families have been affected by these events. No one who has heard these stories could fail to be moved by the impact these events have had on individual postmasters' lives and their fight for justice over a number of years. I also pay tribute to colleagues on both sides of the House who have supported postmasters in their efforts to expose the truth and to see justice done. I would today like to take the opportunity to update the House on the latest steps Government is taking to ensure fair compensation is paid to postmasters with convictions that have been quashed due to Horizon evidence being essential to their prosecution. In the first instance, we worked with Post Office to deliver interim payments of up to £100,000 for each eligible postmaster. I informed the House of the Government's decision to provide funding for these interim payments last July. Government funding was necessary because Post Office does not have the necessary funds to deliver the appropriate compensation. That is why it turned to Bayes as its 100% shareholder for funding for these interim payments. I am pleased to report to the House that the interim payments are progressing well. The Post Office has received 66 applications for interim payments. Of these, 62 offers have been made, and of these, 50 have been accepted and payments made. Payments made to date have all been for the maximum interim amount of £100,000. I am pleased that these interim payments have helped to deliver an early down payment on the compensation due to affected postmasters in advance of full and final compensation packages being agreed. But that is only the first step. It is right that the focus now shifts to the agreement of full and final settlements. That is why the Government has been working with Post Office to agree funding to facilitate Post Office making final compensation payments to postmasters. As I announced in a written ministerial statement to the House yesterday, Government has now agreed to provide funding for that purpose. We are working with Post Office to enable the final settlement negotiations to begin as soon as possible. To be clear, Post Office is not proposing a new compensation scheme to deliver full and final settlements. Post Office are instead proposing to allow a process of alternative dispute resolution in which Post Office will aim to agree an appropriate level of compensation with each postmaster, recognising the individual circumstances of each case. The Government supports Post Office in its aim of reaching fair settlements with postmasters via alternative dispute resolution, as we believe that this will lead to speedier delivery of compensation to postmasters. I am not in a position to give significant detail today about this process, as the final detailed approach to these negotiations will need to be discussed and agreed between Post Office Limited and individual postmasters and their representatives. I am sure that colleagues will agree with me that it is important that Post Office listens to postmasters' views and that these are taken into account in how these negotiations proceed. Whilst it would be for Post Office to negotiate settlements directly with claimants and their representatives, the Government will work closely with Post Office to ensure that fair compensation is delivered. Mr. Speaker, given the impacts on so many individual lives, it is right that the Government stands behind Post Office and provide this funding to ensure that fair compensation can be made to individuals who were wrongly prosecuted and convicted on the basis of unreliable Horizon evidence. Whilst compensation cannot change what is past, it can provide a degree of recompense for past wrongs. In addition to providing compensation, it is important that we learn lessons so that something similar can never happen again. That is why government has set up the Post Office Horizon IT Inquiry and put it on statutory footing to ensure that it has all the powers it needs to investigate what happened, establish the facts and make recommendations for the future. The inquiry has recently set out the full list of issues that it is investigating, and core participants have started to share key documents with the Chair, Sir Wyn Williams, and his team. We will cooperate fully with the inquiry to ensure that the facts of what happened are established and lessons learned. I commend this statement to the House.
My Lords, can I thank the Minister for the advanced sight of today's statement delivered earlier in the Commons, and I know he agrees from previous questions and debate here in your Lordship's House, that and he said it again tonight, that in no uncertain terms the Subpostmasters and Mistresses scandal is an absolute disgrace. An absolute disgrace on so many levels: financially, judicially, on a human level, on a systems failures level, and most worryingly on a government oversight level. We here all know the details, but it's worth repeating a few of them. Hundreds of sub-postmasters were sacked or prosecuted in the space of 16 years and wrongfully labelled as thieves and fraudsters by the Post Office and our judicial system. Their lives were made hell, and all because of an IT glitch in the Post Office system that was known about. What makes this even more shameful is the length that the Post Office went to hide it. The fact that the Post Office spent £32 million denying these claims, bullying those wrongly accused into false guilty pleas is bad enough. But what makes the story even worse is that we only got to the truth of the case finally when it made it to one of the highest courts of this land. Tens of millions of pounds of public money were spent trying to stop the case going forwards. This effectively meant that nearly £100 million of taxpayers' money was spent defending the indefensible and spent to cover it up. But even though all postmasters, or the question is it all postmasters and mistresses' convictions are now being quashed and or are in the process of, and that we are working through compensation, this has come too late for many postmasters and mistresses who were wrongly convicted, who were in prison, and some who have sadly passed away. So far, many postmasters and mistresses have only received a fraction of their costs and expenses, as we've heard. This simply isn't good enough, especially as there are cases of postmasters who have had to remortgage their houses, borrow money from family and friends to cover their legal costs. Now, I listened to the words of the Minister, and we do appreciate them, but the government should do more. It should do all it can do to make sure that all of those wrongly accused postmasters and mistresses receive the compensation they're entitled to, and as soon as possible. So as much as I welcome the Minister signing off on a compensation scheme, it is disappointing that it has taken us to this point to get a scheme in place. And I hope today marks the start of the government ramping up their efforts to get the postmasters and mistresses compensation they rightly deserve. But for me, one of the most alarming and shameful aspects of the whole scandal is the failure of our courts and judicial system. In all of the cases, postmasters being wrongly found guilty, the system believed the computers. And we knew that there was possibility of glitches within those computers. 640 cases. How did this not raise alarm bells inside the Post Office or inside the board? I hope the inquiry, and I apologise for not going through the terms, the Minister said that the terms had been set, but I do hope that the inquiry will look at the legal failures that only compounded and exacerbated the problem. The idea that a machine was believed in so many cases is extremely worrying. My Lords, we all agree that lessons must be learned from this. The Horizon system contained bugs, errors and defects, according to the High Court. and we should not use evidence based on faulty technical systems as evidence in court, especially when the evidence provided by the Horizon systems could not be backed up by any personal human evidence. So in conclusion, I welcome the Government's new scheme to ensure that all postmasters and mistresses are rightly receive compensation. The Government is the owner of the Post Office and should, and we have heard in our other place and here in your Lordship's house today, they are taking the responsibility for that and the actions to put it correct. The truth is that for too long the Government sat on the sidelines and made little or no attempt to stop this scandal, which was ruining hundreds of people's lives. So just before I finish, could I press the Minister on some key facts? Can the Minister confirm compensation is for everyone, those involved in civil as well as those in criminal prosecution or processes against them should receive justice? The Minister used the word quashed. But there are many other cases that are outside of that remit where individuals and people have been affected. Secondly, can the Minister also confirm that any settlement will not affect the Post Office's core funding? The Post Office has a job to do, and we would not like to see the core funding affected in that. And thirdly, and the Minister has dealt with this in the past, and I appreciate his involvement and engagement on this, those involved in the initial mishandling and subsequent failures, as well as the cover-up, need to take responsibility for their actions and their fair share of the blame. Questions have been asked about previous chief executives and board members in your Lordship's house, but can the Minister confirm whether any of those involved at board level and senior executive level have been rewarded, as that in itself would be a slap in the face for many of those involved. And I finally cannot finish this speech on this scandal without putting on record our thanks to Lord Arbuthnot and other members across your Lordship's house and in the other place for their continued and unstinting drive for justice.
Yeah.
My Lords, until 2011 I was an elected member of the Welsh Assembly, and I dealt at that time with the cases of a number of sub-postmasters from Cardiff and the surrounding area. It struck me immediately when they got in touch with me as a group that it was highly unlikely that so many sub-postmasters were crooks. Here were a group of people who were upright, respected citizens at the hub of their community. It seemed ludicrous from the start, and it is a scandal that this has been allowed to go on so long in the face of mounting evidence of a problem with the whole thing. 736 sub-postmasters and sub-postmistresses, an average of one a week, were prosecuted. And there's real bad faith on the part of the Post Office that they pretended to the individuals that they were alone. They hid from them the fact that there were hundreds of others, and it took a long time for many of them to discover that they were in the company of a very large number of colleagues. Now, some of them went to prison following convictions for false accounting and theft. Many were financially ruined and were shunned by their communities. Some went bankrupt as they tried to make up the shortfall in order to avoid prosecution. Some committed suicide, and many have died since, some of them worn out by the fight that they had to undertake. So my questions to the Noble Lord the Minister is that it's quite clear that the original process for postmasters to gain recompense was flawed. Some 555 of them who joined in a group action were forced to settle because they ran out of money to continue with their action, and they were paid far less in compensation than they had paid to the Post Office to balance their accounts. Does this statement here today mean that those people will now have their cases reviewed and receive proper fairness in their compensation. Can the noble lady and noble Lord the Minister give us a time frame for when those affected by the scandal will have their cases dealt with? Will it be 2022 when we see the end of this terrible process, or is it, in his estimation, going to take longer? Will the government undertake to compensate victims for consequential loss as well as financial loss as part of the commitment today? Because many of them suffered so badly emotionally, and their families suffered too. And finally, can I ask the noble Lord the Minister that there is a doubt about the extent of what the government is promising. The statement refers to postmasters with convictions. Many were accused and were not convicted, but nevertheless suffered. Many of them personally made up the monies supposedly owed by them to the post office, and they have evidence of that. Will those people receive just compensation? Thank you, my lords.
Well, let me first thank Lord McNichol and Baroness Randerson for their points. I think almost uniquely in my time on the front bench, I think I agree with virtually everything that both noble lords have said. Lord McNichol referred to it as an absolute disgrace. Baroness Randerson referred to it as a scandal. I think, if anything, they are almost understatements for the extent of the total travesty that has occurred. And you know, I don't think there is any party political difference on these matters. You know, this is not a recent scandal. It's gone on for decades under previous Labour governments, under coalition governments, and under this government. And if obviously we can't go back and right what the clear manifest injustice that went wrong in the past, but we can provide adequate levels of compensation, and I think we are doing that. I also want to join with Lord McNichol in paying tribute to the parliamentarians on all sides, actually, who drew attention to this scandal, and hopefully my noble friend Lord Arbuthnot will intervene shortly, but he played a crucial role both in the other place and in here, as did a number of MPs on both sides, as well as, to be fair, some campaigning journalists. Nick Wallace from the BBC played a major role in bringing it to account. And of course, there is a full inquiry going on now with statutory powers, which will hopefully get to the bottom of exactly what went wrong, who is responsible, and if it is any allegations against ministers, either serving or previous. And my friend in the other place, Paul Scully, he did say that we will hold our hands up and acknowledge if mistakes have been made, which is only correct. In terms of the questions that were asked in relation to compensation, the funding we announced yesterday is for compensation for postmasters with convictions that have been quashed due to Horizon evidence being essential to their prosecution. There is a separate scheme, the historical shortfall scheme, which over 2,500 people applied to for compensation, and the Post Office is working through those applications, and the government are ensuring that it is pushed forward as quickly as possible. On the 555 who took the first court cases about Horizon against the Post Office, the settlement reached in 2019 was full and final. However, as the Minister for Postal Affairs said this afternoon in another place, it is important to acknowledge the work that they have done in bringing the facts to light, and the Minister for Postal Affairs has committed to continue to work with them to see what we can do. On Lord McNichol's question on will the compensation affect the Post Office's core funding, the question of the Post Office's core funding and to support its network is a totally separate matter to the question of funding for compensation that we are here today, and that will proceed separately. With regard to Noble Lord's point about will those involved have been rewarded with senior jobs elsewhere, There's a limit to what I can say about this, given that the inquiry is ongoing, but the Noble Lord can refer to past comments that I have made on that in this House, and I certainly stand by my views at that point. I think they were most of the questions that asked for both Baroness Ryan. Also, Baroness Ryan asked me about timescales for delivery of compensation. The Post Office proposes to follow a process of alternative dispute resolution to reach full and final settlements with postmasters. The details of that approach will need to be discussed and agreed between Post Office Limited and individual postmasters and their representatives, and therefore there's a limit to what I can say about that, because I simply don't know the answer to that question. And the reason, the need to get swift payments is, of course, why we have agreed the interim settlements. But you know, the reason that we are going down the ADR process is to try and get settlements as quickly as possible. I think they were the questions that I was asked.
My Lords, I acknowledge that this is very good news, and I'm grateful to my noble friend for the work that he is doing and has done behind the scenes on it. Can I press my noble friend on the question asked by the noble Baroness Randerson about the question of why this statement is limited to those sub-postmasters who have had convictions overturned? Because surely the same moral principles apply not just to those who've been wrongly convicted, but also to those who were acquitted, to those who were wrongly sued, to those like Lee Castleton, who were bankrupted and who have not come out of that, including the 555 in the group litigation. Because in another place this afternoon, our noble friend, the Minister, hinted that he was softening the government's line on full and final settlement. Could he confirm that that is the case?
Well, before I answer Noble Lord's question, let me again pay tribute to the work that he has done over many years on this scandal to make sure that the world knows the truth about what took place. And he does make a valid comment about the similarity of moral principles between the various cases. I can go no further than to confirm what the Minister said in another place, and let me quote it to him in full. The 555 sub-postmasters who were part of the High Court case performed a massive public service by exposing the wrongdoings within the Post Office, and I recognise the deep frustration at the fact that because they agreed that the settlement with the Post Office would be a full and final one, they do not qualify for these compensation payments. I have met with some of those people, and as I said, I will continue to work on what more we can do.
Could I, like everybody else, pay tribute to the Noble Lord Arbuthnot for the work that he's done? Could I also acknowledge, as the Noble Lord Arbuthnot has done, that this is significant because it means the government, central government, will fund all the compensation? Could I also welcome what the Noble Lord Callanan said in answer to one of the questions from the front benches? He said, we know there was a terrible scandal. What we've got to do now, and I'm paraphrasing, is provide adequate compensation for those who were affected. We all understand what the scandal was. Mr. Justice Fraser in the High Court has laid it out, and what it involved was the Post Office, despite senior management knowing that there were problems with the IT, which was probably identifying wrong shortfalls, nevertheless allowing sub-postmasters to be charged in millions of pounds for those shortfalls, and in some cases allowing them to be prosecuted, and in some other cases those who were prosecuted being sent to jail. All of the people who suffered in this way, the Post Office knowing the IT system was unreliable, knowing, that's what Mr. Justice Fraser said, nevertheless allowed them to be prosecuted or sued, and in some cases bankrupted. They're all entitled to compensation. There are three categories. First of all, those who went to prison, or were convicted, some of them may have gone to prison, they must be compensated. There is no doubt about it. Secondly, those not covered by the settlement, that's people other than the 555, could Lord Callanan confirm that they will be compensated? Because there is no other basis. There's no possible distinction that can be drawn with them. There's no full and final settlement argument in respect of them. And then thirdly, the group who are party to the settlement. And the noble lord, because he's well informed on this, will know that 56 million was recovered in the settlement. 46 million of that went on costs. And he's nodding because he's clever and knows everything. And then that left 11 million in relation to 550 sub-postmasters whose average loss was 700,000, giving them £20,000 in that's all they got. Surely, if we are keen that they be fairly compensated, that third category should also be compensated as well. Could the noble lord deal with each of the three categories I've identified?
Excellent. Yeah.
I agree substantively with many of the points that the noble lord is making. He's tempting me to qualify to comment on the lawyers of his profession who took part in funding the case of the 555 members and the amount that went in legal fees, which I perhaps should not do, even in this House. And I sympathise greatly with many of the points that he's made. I perhaps go even further, and that even when the Post Office knew about many of these problems, they then attempted, it appears, to cover it up. But these facts will emerge in the inquiry that is taking place, and the noble judge who is leading it is doing extremely well and is progressing with exposing that injustice. Those outside of the 555 settlement are able, of course, to secure compensation through the historical shortfall scheme, which is the other one that I mentioned in my response to Lord McNichols. And then in the third category, Paul Scully in the other place did, and I quoted his words earlier, certainly go further than the government has gone before in those points, and he has promised to work with those who were affected.
I absolutely join with others in welcoming this statement, and also in paying the tributes paid by the noble Lord Nicholson, first of all, to the noble Lord Arbuthnot. And also I did welcome the Minister's praise for the journalist Nick Wallace, and that's the main route by which I have heard about this. But my noble friend Baroness Randerson talked about the way that individuals were sort of picked off and given to understand that they were the only ones who were in trouble. And I have a certain uncomfortable echo of that, in the way that all these different categories are being treated differently and put in silos. So we've got these 66 covered by this new scheme, those who've been acquitted. Then we've got the 555 civil litigants who settled. Then there are around, I think Noble Lord said, 2,500 applicants to the historic shortfall scheme, and then there's maybe others. So there's thousands of other people who are all being treated differently. And it seems to me that we need some kind of holistic approach, because they're all in the same moral boat. They're all the victims of the most appalling scandal. And it's not a political scandal, but it's a public scandal. And it seems to me, my noble friend, my friend in the other house, Mr. Alistair Carmichael, had a debate in Westminster Hall, and he referred to the ongoing problems in the attitude of the Post Office, the arrogance. So, can we cut through that arrogance? Will the government cut through that arrogance and actually treat all of these thousands of victims of the Post Office in a similar way, and not divide and rule, which is unfortunately what is an echo that is coming to me?
I don't think that's an entirely fair comment. I mean, we, as ministerial team, as a government, we have inherited this scandal. We are endeavouring within the powers that we had and within the legal procedures. And we can't ignore the fact that a civil court case has taken place and it was in full and final settlement. We have to negotiate within government for additional funding to be made available, and I can assure the noble lady that the Minister for Postal Affairs is attempting to do that, is trying to work with the parties, and is trying to bring this to a resolution. There is clearly moral equivalence between the different categories, even if there is not necessarily at this stage a legal equivalent. And I'm not a lawyer, but to be fair, there are differences in the cases, and it would be right for the government to try and compensate them all to the greatest degree possible within the existing legal procedures. And my right honourable friend is attempting to do that. The noble lady referred to the culture of the Post Office. I think, again, her comment was a little unfair. The Post Office is under new leadership now. They have committed to changing their ways. I can assure the noble lady that ministers regularly discuss this with the Post Office. They have a programme of change, including the appointment of 2 recent postmaster non-executive directors to try and get some say in the senior leadership team from those working on the ground. So I know the new chief executive is very committed to doing his best to overcome this scandal, to right the wrongs and to put the business on a sound footing in the future.
My Lords, having had responsibility for the Post Office for a period in the past, I'm very well aware that ministers are advised to stand firm on seemingly solid grounds, only for it to become clear in the long term that it is not defensible. It was probably the most disturbing thing that I had to deal with. Will the minister take a deep breath and accept that the litigation involving 555 former postmasters, who, as he said, performed a massive public service, was not conducted on a fair basis, and act accordingly?
I can certainly confirm what the noble lady has said in terms of briefings that are given to ministers, and indeed similar briefings were given to me when I first started in the department, and I went back and started to ask more questions and started to query it, and Paul Scully was new in his job at the time, and I discussed it with him, and we both agreed that we needed to do more on this. And then since then, subsequently, it wasn't purely due to our actions. Lots more information has come about, and there's been various court cases, etc. But I think it is certainly true that the culture of government is always to put up a firewall and try to stand firm. And there are occasions when we just need to accept that things have gone terribly, terribly wrong, and do what you can to then put them right, which is what I think we are doing. I can't go any further than the answers I've already given in terms of the compensation to the 555, but I have great faith in the Minister for Postal Affairs, who is ministerially responsible for this, that he will do whatever he can within the system.
My Lords.
The Minister has said there's an inquiry. But is the government confident, with what it already knows, that such a scandal can never happen again?
I hesitate to give the noble lord an unequivocal assurance because I don't think anybody can do that. I can certainly say from the current ministerial team that we are absolutely determined to learn whatever lessons we are told to learn by the inquiry, to take on board their recommendations and put in place whatever measures are required to make sure that it never happens again.
My Lords, we're clearly united that this is a scandal, and we're clearly united in our regard and respect for my noble friend, Lord Arbuthnot. Again, on the 555 subpostmasters who settled at the point that they did, without knowing themselves that there was more evidence that was to emerge, but that, as we understand it, the Post Office at the time did know that they were still in the wrong and had not disclosed information that later came to light. It seems to me that the 555 had been let down by people in authority at every step of the way, and we are, if we're not careful, going to let them down again when they are clearly being dealt an injustice at this time. I'm grateful for what my noble friend the Minister has said already, but I hope he can agree and acknowledge just how strong the feeling is that this matter is dealt with. And can he also tell us, is Fujitsu going to be liable for any of the funding that is going to be necessary to pay this compensation?
I think the answer to my noble friend is that these are matters that will be considered by the inquiry. I think I may even be right in saying that there are court proceedings ongoing involving Fujitsu, so I better be careful what I say on this matter. But again, I can't go any further than what I've already said about the 555. I think it goes back to the answer that I gave to Lord Falconer earlier. One of the reasons why the legal fees incurred in that case were so high is because the Post Office fought at every step of the way and put in place the maximum legal barriers to those poor individuals receiving the compensation that they were deserving. And I think that's one of the matters that I hope will be inquired into properly and appropriate conclusions drawn.
My Lords, like others, I pay tribute to Lord Arbuthnot, my noble friend, for all he's done. I'd also like to pay tribute to my noble friend the Minister, because he has made his own personal discomfort, sense of collective guilt and everything very plain whenever he's appeared at the dispatch box. But, my Lords, I'm always a bit suspicious when words like as soon as possible are used. Can we not have a deadline? Can we not have a date, a realistic date, such as the 30th of June of 2022, when this can be fully settled? Because people's futures are in suspense, and people are dying now. We really do need proper justice, and proper justice must mean that they must have a date by which they will know this thing has been settled once and for all.
Well, I thank my noble friend for his comments, but ministerial discomfort is nothing compared to massively insignificant compared to the injustices and discomfort that has occurred to all these poor sub-postmasters. I can't give him a date for reasons that I set out earlier. We are going down the alternative dispute resolution procedure because we think that will bring about a faster resolution for the claimants. We have put in place the interim payments so that some compensation is paid quickly and immediately, and I set out in my statement how that has now been paid. And I can go no further than say we want it done as quickly as possible. That's why we've gone down the ADR procedure, but even though I would like to, I cannot give him a final date.
My Lords, I would like to start by endorsing and adopting almost everything that was said by Lord McNichol and Baroness Mirandison in particular. And I have one question. If it's a theoretical question, but if the inquiry is, the Wynne Williams inquiry, is to find culpability on the part of individuals within the management and senior management of the Post Office, will the government, as shareholders, as the principal shareholders in the Post Office, consider bringing recourse actions against those individuals?
Well, this is a complex issue stretching back over many years, perhaps even decades, with decisions taken at various levels at post offices and, of course, before that when it was Royal Mail. But I can say that we are totally committed to seeing these long-standing issues resolved, learning what went wrong through the inquiry and making sure that it cannot happen again. And whether the directors active at the time should be the subject of disqualification proceedings, as again is a legal procedure set out and managed by the Insolvency Service in accordance with the appropriate legislation, and I am certain that they will do that if necessary.
I take we are ready to receive the report of the Police, Crime, Sentencing and Courts Bill. Baroness Williams of Trafford.
Sorry? Oh. Move very slowly because we've got to wait till 2:10 past. Very slowly. Go very slowly.